Let's see what the coach can do.
Welcome back to the Locker Room. My name is Tommy Zucker, aka Coach Cattle, and today we're going to be talking about the decline of competitive CoD, specifically metas. As I stated in my previous video, I want to restate that I love this game and this series. This isn't a hate video, but rather an informational video regarding CoD and its competitive meta. For it to improve, it needs to be analyzed objectively. If I can't accurately point out the history of the competitive CoD meta with all of its positives and negatives, I'm doing this series a disservice. While some positive things will be pointed out towards the beginning of the series, most of the negative things will be mentioned about its fall from its peak. First question we need to ask ourselves is what makes a competitive CoD meta good? The first answer is that there is an attempt for everything within the base game to be used in competitive play. The less different the base game is to the competitive rule set, the easier it is for casual players to get into competitive. There should also be an attempt to limit as much as possible regarding gentlemen's agreements or GAs and bans. Secondly, the game needs to be balanced towards a diverse set of playstyles. There should be multiple classes of weapons and ideally multiple weapons that can be used within each class. Equipment should consist of multiple options for both lethals and tacticals. Perks should be evenly balanced so that every perk is competitively viable. With proper balancing, you get what's called a rock, paper, scissors meta. Everything is a counter and can be a counter. I want to put out a disclaimer before we get into listing all of the comp CoD metas. I missed out on a few CoDs due to life events that brought me away from gaming. I'll list the games into two categories, ones that I played for a short period of time or later on in its life cycle, and ones that I did not play. Every other game that was not mentioned, I have quite a bit of experience playing competitively. CoD 4 wasn't the birthplace of competitive CoD because CoD 2 holds that title. It is, however, the first CoD that laid a substantial foundation for the scene. As rough around the edges as the meta was, it did outline what all future CoD metas would look like with their implementation of Create a Class. You had two primary classes of weapons that were used: assault rifles and submachine guns. Occasionally, a sniper would be pulled out in search and destroy on specific maps. Frag grenades were extremely strong and could be thrown over buildings, catching people off spawn. The tacticals were flashes, stuns, and smokes. Flashes were seen to be overpowered or cheesy, and smokes were rarely used or even banned within specific rules. Stuns were the defaults. The perks were all uniform with the exception of stopping power and juggernaut. The main weapons used were the M16 with the red dot sight or an MP5 with a red dot sight. The AK-74U was also quite viable, and in the S&D scene, a sniper was used, which was the M40. A version of the competitive CoD meta spawned on PC called Pro Mod. I thought I would mention it because it is competitive CoD, but much different than what the mainstream community thinks of as competitive. There are a total of 5 players per team playing S&D only. You can have a maximum of 1 sniper, 1 shotgun, 2 SMGs, or 5 ARs per team. There are no attachments besides silencers and no perks. Each player must run a smoke or a flash, and it's a perfect hybrid of CoD and Counter-Strike. In the first perk slot, Bandolier was used because it was the only perks without access to extra explosives or utility. In the third perk slot, Dead Silence was used, which quieted your footsteps. The biggest choice within the meta was to whether use Stopping Power or Juggernaut in the second perk slot. Stopping Power was a must run on the M16 because it allowed you to one-burst people across the map. On SMGs, it was nice because you could hit players at longer ranges since the perk allowed you to kill a player with 1 less bullet. Juggernaut, on the other hand, also allowed you to take 1 more bullet before dying. This was mostly used on sub players who want to be more mobile and survive longer. It was a direct counter against the M16 with Stopping Power. Overall, there wasn't much to this game in terms of meta diversity. Its purpose was more to lay the foundation rather than to build a house. I'm going to skip over World at War simply because it was so similar to CoD 4. While I do love this game, it's simply just a reskin of CoD 4 but in a World War II time period. It was actually less diverse because of the MP40, an SMG that with stopping power equipped, it was a one-shot headshot at any range unless the other player had Juggernaut on. I will leave a link down below to a streamer I found about 5 years ago named Defects. He constantly streams World at War wagers along with other older CoDs such as CoD 4, MW2, MW3. I find World at War wagers to be very entertaining because it's the most overlooked CoD competitively since CoD 4 had a 2-year life cycle. As I'm editing this video, I wanted to come in really quick and just make a side note about the MW2 meta. While the clips that you're seeing were earlier on during the MW2 life cycle, so the meta was more diverse, I left out a few different guns that were used. So instead of the 4 ARs and the 1 SMG, you actually have 5 ARs and 2 SMGs, so this game was actually way more diverse than what I even remembered. And some of the rules may be GB rules instead of MLG rules, which were different back then. GB rules were less restrictive, but I did want to mention that because I actually forgot how diverse this game was, and you could actually use everything simply because everything was overpowered, so I just wanted to chime in and add that, but let's go ahead and get into the MW2 section. MW2 was the first game where weapon and perk diversity really began to show its true colors. There were multiple assault rifles that could be used, and there were multiple different builds for SMGs, which gave them diversity and playstyle. The equipment allowed was roughly the same as CoD 4, with the addition of the Simtex being a more popular choice. The attachments ranged from red dot sight, FMJ, which helped with bullet penetration, extended mags, and even silencers. There were 4 perks that you could choose from between the perks 1 and perk 2 slots, which helped define roles more clearly. The roles expanded from just AR and SMG to Slayer, Support, and OBJ. The main assault rifles that were used were the ACR and the FAMAS, both with the red dot sights. The ACR had almost 0 recoil, a fast fire rate, and was extremely accurate across long ranges. The FAMAS was a 3-round burst rifle with a fast fire rate and short delay between the bursts. It too was great at long range engagements. There were other guns that were used in very specific maps, situations, and modes, such as the TAC-21 and the SCAR-H, both with the FMJ attachment. The TAC wasn't accurate, and its biggest advantage was its high damage and the ability to melt people through walls. The SCAR was a weapon that saw more use in years after MW2 was in its prime, specifically in the S&D wager scene. The weapon was overall the best in the game, but its biggest drawback was that it only had a 20-round clip. This is why it never saw much action in 4v4. The only SMG to be used was the UMP-45. This weapon had a good fire rate, low recoil, and was able to be used in all situations. You could tap fire it at long ranges for a kill, or you could destroy an AR player up close. The main attachment was FMJ, but because of how high the damage was, you could use a silencer for more of a stealth build. You did suffer at range, but it could be used in respawn modes quite effectively. To my knowledge, this is the only time that a silencer has been allowed or even used effectively within the meta. The equipment used was stun grenades and smokes. Smokes could have been used quite strategically, but with how infantile this scene was in terms of knowledge and skill, they were still not used to their potential yet. In the EU Deserto rules, flashes were allowed instead of stuns, along with a few other minor changes. This is more of a side note, but the EU scene has always had a slightly different rule set than NA. Most often, they are more restrictive. Simtexes were introduced back in World at War, but their usage in MW2 was the default for the competitive lethals. Frags could still be used in S&D, but with how quickly Simtexes were released, there wasn't much of a reason for frags to be used over Simtexes other than nade spots and the distance. For the first time, the perk section felt impactful. While the last perk would always be Ninja, which quieted your footsteps, in the first 2 slots, you had options. In the first section, you had the choice of Marathon, which gave you unlimited sprint and faster mantle speeds, or Sleight of Hand, which gave you a faster reload and ADS. SMG players would always use Marathon, and it was still viable to use on ARs. Sleight of Hand was only used on slower ARs and snipers. In the second perk slot, your options were Stopping Power or Lightweight. Stopping Power was the default, but if you wanted extra speed with an SMG, you could use Lightweight. The combination of multiple guns and perks helped expand the roles within the game. You had a Slayer playing style who would play slower with ARs using Sleight of Hand and Stopping Power. You had objective players using the UMP-45 with Marathon and Lightweight. You also had a new addition to the roles with the support position. This was a hybrid playstyle of players who had the potential to roam around the map quickly while still providing the slaying power needed. They would use the UMP-45 or an AR with Marathon and Stopping Power. This allowed players to be able to be mobile while still contesting gunfights. MW2 was a big step up for competitive CoD. MW3 had a very similar situation as what World at War did to CoD 4. It was less diverse than MW2 in terms of weapons and perks being used. I'm not going to cover MW3 because it never added anything new to the scene, as the entire game was just more of a polished version of MW2. The Black Ops 1 meta was the closest thing to Halo that we've ever gotten. It was mostly a mono-gun game, which means one gun, with every player using the FAMAS with red dot sight. The perks were exactly the same as well as the equipment. While this may seem like a step backwards in terms of improving the meta, it was more of a step to the side rather than back. There were some instances of the AK-74U, Spectre, and SPAS-12 being used in very specific areas on certain maps, but it was mostly exclusively the FAMAS. The only perk variation was when steady aim would be used instead of sleight of hand on SMGs and shotguns. The only other instance was Scavenger being used by former professional player Fizzerp, who would use it to spam grenades across the map. Occasionally, you would also see players using Marathon instead of Ninja in the third perk slot in CTF specifically, but it didn't happen often, and it was for specific strats on specific sides of the map, depending where you were planning to go. The meta was probably the least diverse competitive CoD meta to ever exist. In the specific case of Black Ops 1, I don't think this is a bad thing. At the time, Black Ops 1 was played alongside Halo Reach at MLG events. It mimicked Halo as a mono-gun game, which turned the focus more on the macro aspect of the game. Everyone started on the same level, so individual gun skill and teamwork was able to be expressed more clearly. The mono-gun meta was great for the scene, but I don't believe that it should happen again. It only worked because the maps were some of the best maps in the entire series. This was the last game that grenades also held such an important role because of how good they were, since Flak Jacket wasn't allowed. Black Ops 2 was the pinnacle of competitive CoD. There's a lot to this, but I'm going to give you the cliff notes of what I've already covered, and I will link below what I have already written down in detail. In the Constitution, a competitive CoD document that lists everything you would ever need to know about the scene, it's over 180 pages, and on page 52 I discuss the meta, I will also link part 1 and part 2 of a Reddit post below about the concept of rock, paper, scissors. Before we touch on the weapons, equipments, and perks, we must first discuss the Pick 10 Create a Class system. Essentially, you have 10 points you can allocate towards your class. Each weapon, attachment, perk, or wildcard costs 1 point. A wildcard allows you to have extra attachments, perks, or equipment. What was so great about this system is that it allowed you to hyper-focus on what you thought was important. You could not run a pistol, which would in return allow you an extra attachment or tactical. You could run less perks to get more attachments on your AR, or you could run an SMG with less attachments to gain more perks. You could take one less attachment and perk in order to get an extra lethal or tactical. The Pick 10 system was perfect, and we have never got anything close to how well balanced this system was and the game was. As for primary assault rifles over the course of the game, 3 different ARs were used. The M8A1 was a 4-round burst rifle that was used consistently during the entire course of the game. The N94 was fully automatic and dominated at medium range that was used regularly throughout the course of the game. The FAL was a single-shot rifle that was used until it got hit with a nerf. There were 4 SMGs within the game, each having a very specific purpose. The MSMC was the main SMG that was consistently used throughout the course of the game. It did a little bit of everything. The PDW had a 50-round magazine with a fast fire rate that eventually stopped being used due to an uncontrollable recoil nerf. The MP7 was later picked up as an alternative as it did have a fast fire rate, 35-round magazine, and was accurate at longer ranges. Finally, the Scorpion was the last SMG used during Black Ops 2. It had the fastest firing rate in the game, which brought along horrible recoil. It acted more similar to a shotgun with how quickly it killed at close range. There were so many different types of weapons used within the game. Shotguns were allowed and were only used on the map Hijacked in the lower deck area. Snipers were balanced as close to perfect as we have ever had it. It's difficult to balance snipers in an FPS game, but since everything else was balanced properly, snipers fell into their role appropriately. While pistols and knives are important, they have never played a larger role before or after this game. Players used 3 different pistols or defaulted to a knife as a secondary if they didn't want a pistol. I'm going to skip over all of the pistols when talking about competitive, but I did want to mention that since they do play a minor part in the meta. The attachments were simple and did one job. You knew what they all did and you knew what you needed for every given situation and circumstance. The attachments were broad enough to allow you to play how you wanted, but simple enough to be understood by casuals. As for the equipment used, there were the standard frag and Simvex grenades in the lethal category. In the tacticals, this is where things get more advanced. You had the option to use stuns, smokes, EMPs, trophy systems, or the black hat. While the last wasn't really used very much and was more of a counter to kill streaks, it still was viable if you were behind in the game. This is where the concept of rock, paper, scissors comes in. If you want to do damage, you ran grenades. If you want to control players' movement, run stuns. If you want to gain information, you ran stuns or EMPs. If you want to deny information, you ran EMPs or smokes. If you want to deny all of these, you ran trophies. Each has a specific purpose and excels in a specific area. They all have their advantages and disadvantages. While trophies may seem to be overpowered, they were purely defensive and provide no offensive capability. They could also be destroyed by EMPs through walls. As for the perks, they are very similar to the equipment category. They all have purposes and can counter or be countered by a specific playstyle. Lightweight, flak jacket, and blind eye could all be used, with blind eye being the only one used in very specific situations. Every perk in the perk 2 slot could be used, which I believe is the first and only time this has ever happened in the history of competitive CoD. While toughness was almost always used because of flinch resistance, other perks like cold-blooded or hardwired were used to counter thermals and EMP grenades, respectively. In the 3rd perk slot, there were some heavy hitters like Ninja, Marathon, Dexterity, and Tactical Mask. All of these perks should be mixed and matched to fit your specific playstyle or counter what the enemy is doing. You only have 10 points to spend, but those 10 points we saw countless class combinations that served a very specific purpose. Hardpoint on Raid needed a different class setup than CTF on Slums, which needed a different class setup than S&D on Standoff. There was so much diversity within the meta because of how it allowed mind games to be played. Swapping between stuns, EMPs, and trophy systems mid-game was common. Running different equipment on players was a necessity. Swapping your perks to counter what was being thrown at you was required to succeed. The combination of all of these weapons, attachments, equipment, perks, maps, and how spawns worked in Hardpoint allowed for the creation of the anchor role. This was the most defensive player who would hold down certain areas of the map like an anchor and give their team beneficial spawns. They used long-range ARs like the M8 who could protect their position and challenge those off of position quite easily. They also typically ran trophy systems to protect their area from any equipment. These 4 roles were now cemented into competitive CoD, and their responsibilities varied slightly between games. The 4 roles are Anchor, Slayer, Support, and OBJ, in order from the slowest to the fastest. The last thing I want to touch on is score streaks. There was a big debate on whether or not they should be used at the time. Personally, I was not for it at the time, but I have to admit they did help with the implementation of casuals into the scene. I think that if there's a wide variety of balanced streaks to be used, then streaks should be used. If there are only 2 or 3 streaks even allowed, I don't believe it's even worth it. The momentum of the game can be shifted so much with the usage of streaks that if there is not a meta within the streaks themselves, then the momentum of the game does not shift far enough. You need the momentum to be able to shift very quickly, otherwise it becomes too weak to have an effect. It's just overkill for the winning team at that point. From here on out, it only goes downhill. I will only briefly touch on games where they go wrong. I may bring up a specific aspect or mechanic that affected the meta that was positive, but I won't dive too deep into the meta. Everything is just a recycled, worse version of the Black Ops 2 meta. Since I spent all this time building up the meta, now I'm going to show you how it falls. As for Ghost, I know the perk system was good. I think that each perk being weighted could be useful, but I also feel that it's only needed when the perks are unbalanced. When you have an amazing perk balancing system like Black Ops 2, you don't really need to have perks with weighted values. I'm not saying that isn't good or couldn't be used, but it seems pointless when you already have something that's just as good or even better in place previously. In Black Ops 3, the ban and protect was the biggest difference between the games. While this would widely be considered the second best game competitively, there are still many problems with ban and protect. The idea of ban and protect is used across many games, but its implementation in CoD was done poorly. I think some format of ban and protect could still be used, but not how we saw it in Black Ops 3. Currently, ban and protect are used in the map and mode selection during pro play. If it were to be used in game, there would have to be multiple factions like an X-Defiant, or characters, champions, and agents like in League and Valorant. Banning one or more of these changes the way the game is played, but it doesn't feel limiting to the players. In Black Ops 3, guns, equipment, and perks could be banned, which had a huge impact on how the game is played. Not that it doesn't in the other games, but a team could ban 4 ARs or SMGs, which would either force teams to not use ARs or SMGs, or they would have to use one that is not competitively viable. In League, if you were able to ban 80 to 90% of the supports, which is a role, the game would be played much differently. It would have an overall negative effect on it being played competitively. If the ban and protect system could stay within the maps, modes, and character factions, that would be the ideal system. I'm not saying that we should go back to characters, but if we did, this would be the best. World War II is just another example of a step back in the meta. It funneled players into very specific roles, which limited players in what they could actually achieve on the map. There's not much to say on this game. Black Ops 4 is yet again another worse version of Black Ops 2. Stim shots completely ruin the pacing of the game. If you can dictate the pace of the game, you have control of the game. Stims give you pace, and grenades give you the chance to have control over a specific area. That chance is your skill with grenades, and using a stim doesn't take any skill. On another note with this game, the flex roll was popularized with the introduction of the Maddox, a hybrid AR SMG gun. Ultimately, the flex roll doesn't exist. It's a job description of a role. Any player can use an AR or an SMG at any time, but that doesn't make them a flex. I don't believe that a gun like this needs to be back in order to have people flex between different playstyles. Again, I'm not saying that it would not be good having this gun, but this gun does not properly address the issues of the players being able to have a diverse playstyle. Cold War had way too many attachments. Limiting the attachments to just a few gives them each more weight. Field upgrades should not exist or need to be reworked entirely. Allowing players to have trophies and grenades without a cost to the rest of their loadout defeats the purpose of having them both. I actually heard someone once say that the purpose of grenades and stuns is to destroy trophies. I'm gonna let that sink in for a little bit. This is one of the main problems with field upgrades and modern CoD players. Their entire argument for existing counters itself. Also, the perk system struggles from the same problems as World War II. You get locked into a specific playstyle and don't have the freedom to play how you want. MW2 2022 was the worst game I have ever played. There were only 2 guns used, which was the TAC and the Vaznev. This is actually an increase from the start of the game when there was a mono gun meta of M4s. Some people use pistols, but most use knives as secondaries. The sniper was occasionally seen in S&D. Everyone, regardless of role, used the exact same class setup. The same perks and the equipment were used for all players. The only difference was that occasionally an SMG player would use a tactical mask in certain scenarios over flak jacket. The attachment system was convoluted because you had to choose between over 200 different attachments. The only thing worse than a time-released perk system was that there was no dead silence as a perk. It was a field upgrade. I can't even begin to get into how horrible of a decision that is. Technically, no red dots on the minimap wasn't a part of the meta, but the combination of both of these game decisions made this game the worst game I have ever played. Modern Warfare 3 2023 suffers from the same problems as Modern Warfare 2 2022. The only difference is that the perk system is now gear, which does allow for more diversity, but not much came from it. Many of these gear were not released on launch and instead released months later, and even after the game's lifecycle has been finished. It's still a 2-gun meta with minimal perk choices. Even looking at Black Ops 6, it's the same exact thing as Cold War, but with the benefit of having 3 perks in the same category. All this does is just provide another example of limiting diversity within the competitive CoD meta. So what can we take from this besides that everything after 2013 was a steep decline? The first thing is that if CoD will ever have a healthy meta, it needs to accomplish a few things. There needs to be very few differences between casual multiplayer and competitive play. If a new or casual player sees the game being played competitively, they should be able to pick up on what's happening quickly. There shouldn't be a question as to why is everyone running the same exact class. The amount of GAs and bans within the meta should be limited as much as possible. The second thing that it needs is to accomplish a healthy balance of weapons, equipment, and perks to be used. All should have a very specific place and purpose. Within the healthy balance, a rock, paper, scissors format should be constructed. Everything can be a counter or be countered by something. While the total amount of diversity is important to the depth, this is the most important towards the quality of the depth. After Black Ops 2, I stopped listing weapons, perks, etc. because it was just redundant. I want to make it clear that it's not that I couldn't have listed more perks, weapons that were in Black Ops 3, Infinite Warfare, Advanced Warfare, whatever game, but they never did it as well as Black Ops 2. There were always less weapons being used, less perks being used, some gimmick, something that just did not fit in to the competitive CoD meta. It was always just something that was done worse. Lastly, an official CoD committee needs to be formed to help regulate the functioning, efficiency, and quality of the CoD comp meta. We have gone far too long with poor quality games dumped out year after year by developers who show no support towards the competitive scene. To make it worse, we have a community and its leaders who make no attempt to improve the quality of the game outside Zuma. If we really want this game to be of the highest quality, we need people talking about the meta constantly. We need to work through the problems verbally, in-game, and on paper. The more people we have speaking about an issue and being informed, the better the decisions can be made. There should be weekly public meetings amongst community leaders about certain topics and potential solutions addressing them. There should be a communal voting process towards these issues after they have been discussed at length. Testing should happen in-game by both its leaders and the community. After all of these, how does the game look on paper? If the stats need to be adjusted, then that's the final step that we can bring to the developers, as it's largely out of our hands for the most part. Ultimately, we can't do much in terms of the game being made for competitive. We can, however, influence how it's played. We have close to 20 years of CoD games to look at the meta along with countless other competitive metas from other games. For us to not have an efficient level of functioning day one of the release of the game each year is something that we must begin to take ownership of. And that's it. That's the end of the video. I hope you guys did like it. I do appreciate all of the support I saw for the last video. I got the most views I've ever got, so I really appreciate you guys showing up and liking it. It did mean a lot. It was a big inspiration and push for this video. So again, if you do like it, throw a like out there just so I know, or at least comment, hey, it was good, or hey, this was bad. Whatever you think about it, just your honest opinion is what matters, and that's what helps me improve. So I appreciate all the support so far. Thanks again. You guys have a good one.